Hi, I'm Dontha Prashanth. I'm a faculty at Azim Premji University. Azim Premji University, in collaboration with Institute for New Economic Thinking, is organizing advanced graduates workshop. As a part of which, we have with us Professor Vamsi Vakalabaranam, who's a faculty at UMass Amherst, and he has come here as a resource person. Professor Vamsi was formerly associated with the University of Hyderabad, Queen's College, New York, and also has had a fellowship with the India-China Institute, in which he was focusing on inequalities. And his main themes of research spans over ideas of economic development and also on the questions of political economy. And particularly in recent past, he has been working on political economy of urban cities, as part of which Professor Vamsi has worked on two major cities of India, one Mumbai and Hyderabad. In economics discipline, he has used socio-spatial approach in which the socio-historical processes of the city were mapped into the process of sampling of the households in order to understand the dynamics of evolution of the city in the neoliberal regime. With this, I'd like to request Professor Vamsi to speak on his present work, which has happened on Hyderabad and Mumbai.
Thank you, Prashant. And thanks for that kind introduction. So the work on cities that you mentioned, this is a work that I'm co-authoring with Shripad Motiram, who is also a professor of economics at University of Massachusetts, Boston. And it's almost a forthcoming book at this point in time. And we have tentatively titled it Diversity and Development, A Tale of Two Cities. So the basic question that we are asking in this book is, does socio-economic diversity matter in enhancing economic development? So that's our hypothesis, that higher the diversity, higher the economic development. And with this in mind, as you already mentioned, we adopt an approach which can be broadly called a socio-spatial dialectic, where spatial processes of within cities are analyzed in conjunction with the social processes. So, how does the city geography alter the social processes? And how do social processes that are structured along axes like class, caste, religion, and gender, how do they alter, the city space? So that is the project, and together, how do they determine economic development outcomes? Right. So that is the basic work, and what we did in order to make this study possible is we selected, as you mentioned, Bombay and Hyderabad, or Mumbai and Hyderabad now, and we conducted household surveys, 1,000 each, in these cities. And the reason why we had to conduct our own surveys, there are two main reasons. One is the National Sample Survey. Organization, they conduct surveys on both the countryside and cities in India, and they have comparable samples for big cities. The issue is the data is not spatialized, so we cannot study spatial processes using the National Sample Survey data. Census has spatialized data, but they do not have a rich socio-economic set of characteristics that are available with the released census data. So, publicly available data will not help us, conduct this investigation, this research investigation. So, we decided to conduct our own surveys where we can study these cities through that socio-spatial dialectic. And once we did that, we sort of divided these cities into historical and contemporary spaces, going back to pre-colonial, colonial period, then the post-colonial period. Again, we split that into the period when, India was more autarkic, between 1950 and 1980s, and then the neoliberal period after 90s. So we build space according to historical and contemporary processes, and then we analyze what this space does to different axes, like class, caste, gender, and religion. And then we look at these axes and how they alter the space. So that is the project. And in one sentence, if I have to, summarize the main thesis of the book, it's basically that in a city, there are multiple neighborhoods. And if a neighborhood has higher diversity along these axes, class or caste or religion, so the rich and the poor live together, or, people from different caste groups live together, or people from different religions live together, for moral and ethical reasons, we may promote diversity, but there are also material reasons. It actually produces better development outcomes. So outcomes like, lower poverty in a more diverse neighborhood, or higher educational attainment, again in a more diverse neighborhood. So that, to summarize the main thesis of the book, so higher diversity is morally good, but higher diversity is also good for economic development. And that is something that we really need to understand, about Indian cities, that for the longest time, historically and even until 1980s, Indian urban process created very diverse city neighborhoods, at the level of a census ward. While, the smallest unit, the enumeration block, if you take an apartment block or a small, very small set of houses, let's say, that's, at that level, there is not too much diversity. But if you go to a higher level of aggregation, like a census ward, then you have a lot of diversity along all these axes, class, caste, and religion. And this diversity, that kind of aggregative diversity at the ward level is much, much higher in India compared to Western cities like New York or Paris or London. So, so that's something to celebrate, our urban process, but it also has better development outcomes.
No, it was also interesting to see the way in which you had divided, for example, when it comes to the city of Hyderabad, into 4 historic units.
Yeah.
One forming part of Secunderabad cantonment region, the other 2 parts having become part of the old city of Nizams, and the newer one, which you've termed as neoliberal city of Hyderabad. So how do you see the different markers of development in these regions? Now, 3 of them being part of the historical process, whereas the neoliberal regime or neoliberal city having come in post-90s. How do you see different markers of development in these 2 regions?
So that's a very interesting question. We were also surprised. When you divide Hyderabad into 4 parts, one part being the earliest, outgrowth of an urban agglomeration, which is the fortified city, also known as Old City. Everybody understands it as Old City, which is south of the Musi River in Hyderabad. And then the second region is what emerged in the 18th, 19th centuries, north of Musi River during the Nizam period. And then you have the British cantonment and, British city, basically, where the British resident, because Hyderabad was a princely state, British always had an indirect way of controlling the princely rulers. So they set up their cantonment in what is now known as Secunderabad. And then the new part of the city, which we call as neoliberal, which emerged after 1960s, 1970s, as a settlement, but it begins to really witness very fast-paced growth after 1980s, 90s, when market-oriented reforms are introduced in India, but also in cities, various cities of India. So what is fascinating is, if I am a poor person, where should I live? I mean, that's another way of asking the same question that you're asking, what are the development indicators? Where would I fare better? And what is fascinating is, in the old city, there is not too much of diversity, because there's a lot of segregation, a lot of, it's become largely a Muslim settlement. And it's also, there's also a lot of self-selection. So it's become poor and, segregated into a Muslim settlement. If you look at the most recent settlement, the neoliberal city, that is rich and, very, professional or upper class dominated. And it also correlates, as we know in the Indian context, correlates very well with the dominant caste. You will always find some exceptions, but largely that is the story. So a poor person will not actually witness significant development in either of these segregated spaces. So if you live in the old city or in the neoliberal city, that's not ideal for a poor person to achieve mobility. Our argument is, the mixed neighbourhoods, the diverse neighbourhoods in Hyderabad exist in the old Nizam area, which is north of Musi River, Abids, Nampalli, that region, or the Secunderabad region, which is also very mixed. So those two neighbourhoods would promote development, or would offer much better opportunities for development, because they are mixed neighbourhoods. There's a lot of interaction. I can also discuss the mechanisms through which that happens. But that is the story. So the two segregated neighbourhoods, the rich neighbourhood may have good outcomes in terms of development, but for a poor person who is marginalized, that is not the neighbourhood to live in. Right? So in a macro sense, a city with more mixed neighbourhoods will have better educational attainment outcome and lower poverty.
We also see the segmentation of space in Mumbai as well, post-90s, with the kind of high-rise buildings that come up. Vis-a-vis, we see flat-surfaced homes, especially in areas that are called as slums, but otherwise these slums were the spaces which began to shape the city by building its foundations. So how do you see this difference?
So Bombay, to talk about Bombay or Mumbai, we divide the city of Mumbai, without the peri-urban, into 5 parts. And the southernmost part of Mumbai is something that really begins to grow during the British period. The southernmost tip, that is the wealthiest part of Bombay, historically and even today. And then to the north of, the Churchgate area, when you go a little north, you begin to see the industrial city. So those were, in the earliest, in the 19th, late 19th, early 20th centuries, those were considered the suburbs of the southernmost part of the city. Dadar region, Dharavi, slum was also a 19th century creation, basically. So these regions were extremely mixed. And then so we divide that part of Bombay into 2 zones, Industrial City 1 and Industrial City 2. And then, there are, to the north of that, Bandra, Bandra region, and, Borivali, that entire region is more recent. And we actually call it neoliberal. Bandra is old. Bandra has some remnants, of very old traditions. But what we notice about Bombay is, especially the industrial city region, but also the southern part of the region is extremely mixed. And it has created, a lot of mixed neighborhoods, a lot of syncretic cultures among Hindus and Muslims, a lot of, syncretic cultures among workers that belong to different caste groups, different class groups. So there is a lot of mixing. even though the at the most fundamental level, the basic units, let's say mohalla or a street, could be somewhat segregated. There was a lot of, at the ward level, there's a lot of mixing in Bombay as well, and Bombay also had, very significant education movements for women, for instance. I didn't talk about gender in the context of Hyderabad, but women in Bombay achieve much higher levels of education, and they have a much higher labor force participation rate. They have much better commuting facilities, they have much better transit facilities. So women can move from one point in the city to another point in the city more safely, more quickly compared to their counterparts in Hyderabad. So that, elevates their labor force participation rate, basically women doing paid work. But even in terms of diversity, Bombay, both the suburbs and the southernmost part of the city, it had a very significant level of diversity, especially after 1950s. Until the British were still ruling the country, the southernmost part was largely, controlled by the British. They lived there, resident, so there was segregation. And to the north of the southernmost part, the fort area, the Churchgate area, Nariman Point, north of that was where the Indians lived. So once the British left, the wealthy Indians moved into the southern part, but the southern part still remained quite diverse. All of this begins to change again, even in Bombay, after 1990s, right? So with the construction of extremely affluent localities, what you could, the contrast as we were discussing between Antilla and Dharavi, that sort of a very stark kind of inequality. Inequalities have always been there in Indian cities, that is, that's not a creation of neoliberal period. But there is also a complete erasure of diversity and also an escalation of inequalities during the neoliberal period, economic inequalities. I think, and Bombay is not an exception to that. Like Hyderabad, you also see a significant increase in segregation levels within the city of Bombay after 1990s. And some of these cherished structures of mixed cultures or mixed neighbourhoods that are epitomized in the chawls of Bombay city, they also began to break down, once the industries, in the 1980s, for instance, the great textile strike, and when the workers began to lose that strike, I think it began to have an impact on some of the, close-knit cultural spaces, and market reforms came and altered the geography of the city in significant ways. So we show all that, the spatial changes and how the social axes then, get realigned, and how a culture of, living in a mixed neighborhood is broken up, and, a culture of segregation is something that is instilled in the, DNA of the city. But it's not yet a finished task. Indian cities are still very mixed, both Bombay and Hyderabad. And Bombay still has a lot of mixed neighborhoods. So it's worth thinking about how we can protect them, right? And how to further promote them. I think, that would be the implication, one of the important implications.
And how do we understand this process from the angle of a political economy? For example, Dalal Benbabali, who's an anthropologist, has worked on the aspects of political economy through a spatial approach as to how the presence of one particular chief minister from one particular caste could benefit those who belong to that particular caste. So this could also exist with other predominant social groups who are there in the realms of power. So when we look at Old City, for example, as you rightly said, it also has widespread segregation, with Muslims forming part of that Old City. So how strong is the play of power in determining outcomes for these different regions, between neoliberal city vis-a-vis the old city that exists?
So in the structuring of space, political economy becomes very important, where resources within the city are allocated. So this is our argument that, a more diverse neighborhood will also facilitate the provision of various services to the poor. So these are the mechanisms. Let me talk about the mechanisms a little bit. So one, when you have a diverse neighborhood, since we also worked on Bombay, think of the chawls that were created with the early industrialization, the residential spaces in Bombay, where workers from different backgrounds, from different religions, from different caste groups, from different classes, they came together, and there was a creation of an integrated consciousness. Living in a chawl, and you would see, class distinctions. Bombay chawls are fascinating. They're fascinating sites of study even today, to the extent that they still survive the gentrification process and so forth. Number two, when multiple communities live together, even if there is not complete harmony among these communities, there is an emergence of a cosmopolitanism. Right? You begin to tolerate each other's presence, and you begin to accept multiple kinds of habits or preferences. The greatest example in India for something like that is Kerala, the state of Kerala, where Hindus, Muslims and Christians, they all coexist. And, if you go to a restaurant, you find all kinds of preferences being satisfied in the same restaurant.
In terms of cuisines
or, the kinds of meat that people eat, and there's tolerance in that society. So that, I would say, that is in the realm of, culinary tastes or, cuisines. But even in broader cultural processes, you see the emergence of something like a cosmopolitanism. It's not harmony necessarily, but it is being able to live in the presence of other communities, which helps you develop, that kind of tolerance, of other communities. And a third mechanism would be, when people of different classes or castes or religions live together, you also see the exchange of information, right? So, suppose, there is somebody from a slightly dominant community, economically, let's say, and that family or that household is in close interaction with another community which is disadvantaged at this point in time because they are spatially juxtaposed. There's a lot of exchange of information that becomes possible, right? Within those interactions. For instance, what kind of job opportunities are available, or what kind of educational opportunities become available. So information exchange is another mechanism through which, some of this can happen. There are also processes, and this also existed in the US, in the 19th century, American cities to some extent. What we broadly call as dependent informality. So, for instance, the poor tend to come and work in, do domestic work or, work as drivers of, personal cars. And there's a lot of exchange of information through that kind of, dependent informality. There are tons of examples of, how this works. But let me give you an example. We just came back to our Hyderabad home from the US, and there's a person who is helping us at home, and she said her children could not get the transfer certificate from some other school, so they were not going to school. So immediately we sprang into action, went to the school, and convinced the principal that, the principal should admit, these two children. And it worked out. So that is, so it's not just in terms of incomes or, providing employment, but also, exchange of potential, benefits, both ways. So that is another channel or mechanism through which, some of these outcomes could become better. Those two children who are now going to school, if they, proceed to higher education, that's going to create upward mobility for that family, right? So I'm just outlining, some of these mechanisms. There's also another mechanism, which is basically if, there's a lot of interaction among, people of different communities. You also, apart from the information exchange, apart from the material exchanges and material benefits, you could also see, a kind of public good provision, that becomes better. Let's say, there is a need for road improvement, right, in the region. If it's only the poor people, and this is the part of the reason why the old city hasn't improved too much. When you have mixed communities, and they're all using the same roads, for instance, or the same infrastructure. I'm just giving you the example of infrastructure. There'll be infrastructural improvements that will benefit everybody. So in all these different ways, I'm just outlining some of the mechanisms. It could be at the level of consciousness, it could be at the level of cosmopolitanism, could be very material in terms of job benefits, it could be material in terms of the infrastructural improvements that can happen, consumptive public goods as we call them. Or, it could also be, this dependent informality, which is not merely income generation, but also a lot of information exchange and, mutual help that, both these communities can receive from each other. Of course, in an ideal society, there should not be hierarchies along class lines or caste lines. I'm saying this is how the urban process works, right? A radical transformation of this would lead to greater equality, and I am an advocate of that. But at this point in time, our task is to identify the mechanisms, and a mixed neighborhood provides all these mechanisms.
So what one can definitely take from what you've argued on is provision of public goods in a space which has mixed set of individuals. The public goods are meant for everyone's consumption and use. So that way, it definitely helps everyone in terms of having that mixed set of individuals. However, when it comes to information, probably how can we understand segmented information that flows in with presence of, for example, there are different sangams. I don't want to name them, but there are different sangams in different habitats of different cities, where they restrict these mobility of information to particular caste and classes in terms of opportunities that are there. So that also exists, but public goods case becomes much more important in diversity.
So my response to the segmented information flows is precisely that, as the neighborhood becomes more and more diverse, it's harder to create segregated sangams, right? So the moment you create a segregated sangam, that is the definition of, reducing diversity. So I'm actually showing wherever it is possible, wherever, the sangams don't exist, where there is cross-information flows. And we do give a lot of examples of that.
Right.
I'm not for a moment disputing the existence of sangams, but once the sangam gets entrenched, it is segregated. But our argument is where such sangams don't exist, or where they have been broken down, like the Bombay Chawal.
So it's a comparison between cities where, for example, where there was an industrialization, where workers from across the villages have come together and have stayed in those locations. So that's where you could see that there's a greater case for.
Exactly. So on that question, there's always what economists call as endogeneity or mutual causation, as people would say. Does diversity really contribute to development, or does development create diverse neighborhoods? Right. So how do we break that? So there are multiple techniques in economics. So what we do is we go back to an earlier moment in the history of these two cities, and we select technically what is known as instrumental variable, but a deeper causal structure, which is setting up of the early industry in these two cities, both in the late 19th to early 20th century in Bombay and later. And in Hyderabad, mostly after 1920s, when Nizam starts an industrialization policy, and then post 1950s, when public sector units come up, we look at those residential neighborhoods, how they became extremely mixed in class and caste and religious terms, and once you find that causal structure, you can establish your deeper argument that the diversity which was created by the earlier industrialization is the reason why those neighborhoods are more conducive for better development outcomes, right? For somebody who is trying to achieve that development. As a tangential but related point, post-90s, both these cities have been witnessing much greater segregation.
Right.
With the wealthy, with the upper caste, they are beginning to out-migrate from, these mixed neighborhoods. And they're setting up their own segregated spaces, enclaves. And thereby, both ghettoizing the earlier mixed neighborhoods, but also, creating enclaves for themselves in the peri-urban regions or in the suburban regions. So the long-term historical and deeper, urban process, which had segregation in the smallest units, but which had also, diversity in the larger neighborhoods or wards, that process has been interrupted with market reforms.
Right.
Right. So we didn't have a perfect process ever, but we had a much better process than what the neoliberal economic process is creating, which is, very segregated kind of city neighborhoods, which are comparable to Western cities.
In fact, the presence of active movements in Hyderabad, particularly in the olden parts of Hyderabad, in the cantonment area, vis-a-vis in Bombay as well, in the Charles, be it through the working class struggles or anti-caste struggles that have happened through the Dalit Panthers, which were very active till 90s.
Yeah.
Post 90s, what I could make a sense of the argument that you're making is that there's a separate creation of spaces through these apartments, so which could prevent the idea of having diverse spaces altogether. That's a very important intervention. But how do you reflect on the way in which these struggles for spaces were happening vis-a-vis how they have changed in this post-90s?
So, no, you're absolutely right. I think, given the market reforms, that is one major development. And the second major development is along the religion axis. There's much greater communalization. There's much greater segregation of especially Hindus and Muslims, but also Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. So that process of segregation has also added to the economic segregation of market reforms. So there are two dominant processes now, post-90s, that are driving the Indian urban process away from what it used to be until the 90s. So to answer your question in, very briefly, this has definitely fragmented struggles that were happening earlier across caste groups or, across religions. So such, the progressive kinds of struggles where, the issues concerning the marginalized, ought to bother everyone. So some of that consciousness that I was talking about, which existed in the mixed neighborhoods to some extent, it was never perfect. I think that has been significantly eroded, so that is the whole point of trying to understand what is happening to cities. And when we think of Indian cities today, now they have probably the entire urban in India has to 30 to 40%, right? 35% according to the last census, but I think it's much higher, and it may show up in the next census whenever it is conducted by the current government. So you basically are going to witness very fast-paced urbanization. So some of these processes need to be understood and interpreted carefully, so that, as you rightly asked, how do we reconstruct these struggles? How do we rebuild some of the movements, that used to be vibrant in these cities until 80s. And because, from the countryside, we are becoming much more of an urban society. So we need to really, as inequality and poverty enter the cities, and there's an urbanization of inequality or urbanization of poverty, how do we also create novel urban struggles? And in order to do that, we need to understand what is happening in the cities to begin with. So this book is basically an attempt to construct, some of those processes as they occur.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Vamsi. This was, it would be worthwhile to look forward to your book, which in fact adopts this novel approach of studying the city through socio-spatial approach. And that also, by bringing in the historical trajectory of evolution of these different spaces. So it will be interesting to look forward to your book.
Thanks very much for talking to me.